What happens when enemy fighter jets at 30,000 feet discover that the washed-up old-timer they've been briefed to easily outmaneuver is actually Colonel Sarah Phantom McKenzie, the most feared combat pilot in NATO history? This story will shatter everything you think you know about age, assumptions, and what it truly means to be a warrior in the sky. The morning sun cast long shadows across Nellis Air Force Base as 62-year-old Sarah McKenzie adjusted her reading glasses and squinted at the duty roster posted on the squadron bulletin board. Her silver hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her weathered hands showed the telltale signs of decades spent gripping control sticks and throttles. Around her, young pilots in their 20s and 30s buzzed with the electric energy of another training day, their voices filled with the cocky confidence that only comes from never having faced real combat. "Morning, Grandma Mac," called out Lieutenant Jake "Hotshot" Rodriguez, a 26-year-old pilot whose pristine flight suit bore more patches than actual flight hours. His buddies snickered as they gathered around the coffee machine, their conversation deliberately loud enough for Sarah to overhear. "Hope you remembered to take your blood pressure medication before today's sim runs. Wouldn't want you having a heart attack at altitude." Sarah's pale blue eyes flicked toward the group, momentarily before returning to the duty roster. She'd been hearing variations of the same joke for the past 8 months since accepting her position as a civilian flight instructor at the base. The younger pilot saw her as nothing more than a relic from a bygone era, a desk-bound bureaucrat who'd probably never pulled more than 3 Gs in her entire career. They had no idea that those same weathered hands had once guided supersonic fighters through dogfights that would make their training exercises look like children's games. "I heard she used to fly cargo planes back in the day, Lieutenant Ashley." Viper Thompson whispered conspiratorially to her wingman. At 28, she was one of the squadron's rising stars, known for her aggressive flying style and complete intolerance for anything she perceived as weakness. Probably spent her whole career hauling supplies between bases. No wonder she seemed so nervous around real fighter aircraft. The assumption wasn't entirely unfair from their perspective. Sarah moved through the squadron operations with the quiet efficiency of someone who preferred to avoid attention. She wore simple civilian clothes instead of a flight suit, carried a worn leather briefcase instead of a tactical gear bag, and spoke in measured tones that never carried the swagger typical of fighter pilots. When she observed their training flights from the control tower, she took notes with the methodical precision of a clerk rather than the sharp-eyed intensity of a combat veteran. "Hey, Mac," Rodriguez called out again, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Are you sure you're qualified to be evaluating our performance? I mean, no offense, but modern fighter tactics have evolved a lot since you were probably flying those old propeller jobs." His comment drew another round of laughter from the assembled pilots, who seemed to view tormenting the elderly instructor as a form of entertainment. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she continued reviewing the training schedule without acknowledging the jab. She'd developed an impressive ability to appear completely absorbed in paperwork while actually listening to every word spoken around her. The young pilot's comments revealed more about their own inexperience than they realized. Their casual dismissal of age and experience, their assumption that youth automatically equated to superior skill, their complete lack of respect for the wisdom that comes from surviving actual combat, all of it spoke to a dangerous overconfidence that could prove fatal in real-world situations. "I bet she's never even been in a real fighter cockpit," Thompson continued, her voice carrying the particular brand of arrogance that comes from excelling in a controlled training environment. "Probably just read about aerial combat in textbooks and thinks that qualifies her to teach us. It's insulting, really, to have someone with no actual fighter experience trying to critique our techniques." The irony of Thompson's statement would have been laughable if it weren't so tragically ignorant. Sarah had indeed read about aerial combat in textbooks. Textbooks, that quoted her own tactical innovations and used her combat missions as case studies, but revealing that information would have defeated the entire purpose of her carefully constructed cover identity. Major Frank Bulldog Harrison, the squadron's executive officer, emerged from the briefing room with a clipboard full of the day's training assignments. At 35, he was old enough to have developed some wisdom, but still young enough to be influenced by the prevailing attitude toward their civilian instructor. "All right, people, listen up," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of his rank. "We've got a special treat today. Our friend Mac here is going to be observing some of our advanced tactical maneuvers from the tower. Try not to embarrass yourselves too badly in front of the civilian." The comment was meant as good-natured ribbing, but Sarah caught the underlying message. Even Harrison, who should have known better, viewed her as little more than a bureaucratic observer whose opinions carried no real weight. The young pilot's attitudes were simply a reflection of the institutional bias that assumed combat effectiveness automatically declined with age. "Don't worry, Major," Rodriguez replied with a cocky grin. "We'll make sure to keep our maneuvers simple enough for the old-timer to follow. Maybe stick to basic formation so she doesn't get confused trying to keep track of who's who." His wingman, Lieutenant Marcus Razor, Chun, nodded in agreement while making exaggerated gestures mimicking someone struggling to use binoculars. Sarah closed her briefcase with a soft click and stood up from the small desk she'd been assigned in the corner of the operations room. Her movements were deliberate and economical, lacking the theatrical flair that characterized many of the younger pilots' gestures. She walked toward the exit with the measured pace of someone who had learned to conserve energy for when it truly mattered. "Try not to break a hip climbing those tower stairs, Grandma," Thompson called after her, eliciting another round of chuckles from the assembled group. "And maybe bring some oxygen in case the altitude gets to you. We wouldn't want you passing out during our demonstration." As Sarah reached the door, she paused momentarily and turned back toward the group. For just an instant, something flickered in her pale blue eyes, a flash of steel that seemed completely at odds with her mild-mannered civilian appearance. But the moment passed so quickly that none of the pilots noticed, and Sarah continued toward the control tower without saying a word. The young aviators had no idea that their harmless elderly instructor had spent the previous evening reviewing classified intelligence reports about increased enemy activity along the eastern border. They didn't know that her simple observations of their training flights were actually detailed tactical assessments that she was forwarding to Pentagon officials concerned about the squadron's readiness for potential combat operations. Most importantly, they had no clue that the weathered hands they mocked had once guided an F-16 through a furball involving 12 enemy fighters, emerging victorious against odds that military analysts still described as impossible. But Sarah McKenzie had learned long ago that the most dangerous enemies were often the ones who underestimated you. She climbed the control tower stairs with the same quiet determination that had once carried her through hostile airspace, knowing that, sooner or later, these young pilots would discover exactly what kind of instructor they'd been dismissing. The question wasn't whether they would face that revelation, it was whether they would survive the experience that would force them to confront it. The morning briefing continued below as Sarah settled into her position in the control tower, her experienced eyes already scanning the horizon for signs of the storm that she knew was coming. Because in her world, storms didn't announce themselves with thunder and lightning. They arrived in the form of enemy aircraft appearing where they shouldn't be, carrying weapons designed to test every assumption about age, experience, and what it truly meant to be a warrior in the unforgiving arena of aerial combat. The control tower at Nellis Air Force Base stood like a concrete sentinel against the Nevada desert sky, its windows offering a panoramic view of the runway where America's most advanced fighter aircraft prepared for another day of training exercises. Sarah McKenzie settled into her designated observation chair, an uncomfortable metal fold-out that had clearly been an afterthought in the tower's design. Her worn leather briefcase sat beside her, containing the carefully maintained logbooks and evaluation forms that the squadron leadership believed represented the full extent of her qualifications. The tower's primary air traffic controllers barely acknowledged her presence, treating her like a piece of furniture that happened to breathe and occasionally take notes. Senior Master Sergeant Robert Tower Williams, a career air traffic controller with 23 years of service, had made it clear from day one that civilian observers were merely tolerated rather than welcomed in his domain. His weathered face, lined by decades of squinting at aircraft through binoculars, rarely showed emotion beyond mild irritation when forced to interact with non-military personnel. "Ma'am, you'll need to keep your observations to yourself during active flight operations," Williams had instructed her during her first day in the tower. "The pilots don't need distractions from civilians who don't understand the complexities of modern air combat." His tone carried the polite dismissal of someone addressing a tourist rather than a professional colleague. Through the tower's thick glass windows, Sarah watched the morning's first wave of F-16 Fighting Falcons taxi toward the runway. The aircraft moved with the predatory grace of apex predators, their sleek forms bristling with the technological sophistication that represented decades of aerospace engineering advancement. But Sarah's trained eye immediately noticed flaws in their formation discipline that would have earned sharp corrections from her old squadron commanders. Lieutenant Rodriguez's aircraft, tail number 910417, weaved slightly during taxi operations, a sign of either mechanical issues or pilot inexperience. The young aviator's radio communications crackled through the tower's speakers with the casual informality that had become standard in peacetime operations. "Tower, this is Hotshot, requesting clearance for takeoff on runway 27. The weather looks perfect for showing off some fancy flying today." The comment drew chuckles from the other controllers, but Sarah's expression remained neutral. In her experience, pilots who felt the need to announce their intentions were usually compensating for deeper insecurities about their actual capabilities. Real confidence was quiet, professional, and focused entirely on mission accomplishment rather than personal glory. "Hotshot, you're cleared for takeoff," Williams responded with the practiced efficiency of someone who had guided thousands of aircraft through similar procedures. "Winds are light and variable, visibility unlimited. Try not to embarrass yourself out there with the civilians watching." Sarah's fingers tightened imperceptibly around her pen as she made notes in her evaluation book. The casual dismissal of her presence had become so routine that she barely registered it anymore, but the underlying attitude it represented continued to concern her. These young pilots and their support staff had developed a dangerous tendency to view their training exercises as entertainment rather than preparation for the life and death realities of actual combat. Lieutenant Thompson's voice joined the radio chatter as her F-16 moved into position behind Rodriguez's aircraft. "Tower, this is Viper requesting clearance to follow Hotshot. Going to show our observer what real fighter pilots look like in action." Her tone carried the aggressive confidence that had made her one of the squadron's most decorated training pilots, but Sarah could hear the subtle tension that suggested underlying insecurity. The two aircraft accelerated down the runway with the thunderous roar of afterburners igniting, their engines producing the distinctive blue-orange flame that marked full military power. Sarah watched their takeoff procedures with the critical eye of someone who had performed similar maneuvers under circumstances where mechanical failure or pilot error meant certain death. Both pilots executed textbook takeoffs, but their radio discipline remained sloppy and their formation flying lacked the precision that would be essential in combat situations. "Not bad for a couple of kids," muttered Technical Sergeant Maria Santos, the tower's junior air traffic controller. At 31, she was old enough to have developed some perspective on the younger generation of pilots, but still young enough to be influenced by their attitudes. Of course, they're just playing around up there. Real combat flying is probably a lot different from what we see in these training exercises. Sarah's pale blue eyes flicked toward Santos momentarily before returning to the airspace where Rodriguez and Thompson were beginning their practice engagement sequence. The comment revealed the same fundamental misunderstanding that plagued the entire squadron. The assumption that combat flying was somehow dramatically different from the skills they practiced every day, rather than simply those same skills, performed under lethal pressure. I wonder what Mac thinks of all this, Santos continued, nodding toward Sarah's position near the observation windows. Probably looks pretty impressive to someone who's never seen real fighter operations before. Must be exciting for a civilian to watch actual military aircraft in action. The irony of Santos's observation was lost on everyone in the tower, except Sarah herself. She had indeed witnessed real fighter operations before, but from the perspective of someone whose survival depended on split-second decisions and perfect execution rather than as a casual observer. The young sergeant's assumption that Sarah's civilian status automatically meant inexperience with military aviation was both understandable and completely wrong. Major Harrison's voice crackled over the radio from his position as flight leader for the day's advanced tactical exercise. Tower, this is Bulldog. We're proceeding to the training area for some CM work. Should be good entertainment for anyone watching from the ground. His comment was clearly intended for Sarah's benefit. Another example of the squadron's tendency to treat her presence as a novelty rather than a professional evaluation. Sarah continued making notes in her logbook, her handwriting neat and precise. Despite the decades that had passed since she'd last filled out similar forms in active duty situations, her observations focused on tactical errors that the pilots probably didn't even realize they were making, formation gaps that would invite enemy exploitation, communication procedures that would compromise operational security, and approach angles that advertised their intentions to any competent adversary. The morning sun climbed higher in the desert sky as more aircraft joined the training exercise, their contrails marking geometric patterns against the azure backdrop. Sarah watched Lieutenant Chun's F-16 execute a climbing turn that looked impressive to untrained observers, but actually presented his aircraft's most vulnerable aspect to potential threats. His radio call confirmed her assessment of his tactical awareness. Razor here, initiating aggressive climb to gain positional advantage, Chun announced with the enthusiasm of someone who had read about air combat tactics but never experienced their application under mortal pressure. Going to show these guys some real fighter pilot moves. The comment drew approving responses from his squadron mates, but Sarah's expression remained impassive. Chun's maneuver was textbook perfect from a technical standpoint, but strategically naive in ways that would prove fatal against experienced enemy pilots. The young aviator's confidence in his abilities was admirable, but it wasn't backed by the hard-earned wisdom that came from surviving actual combat situations. Kids these days have no idea what real flying looks like, Williams observed, his voice carrying the mixture of pride and concern that characterized most career military professionals watching the next generation. They're skilled enough, but they lack the edge that comes from knowing your life depends on every decision you make up there. Sarah's fingers paused in their note-taking as Williams's comment registered. The senior air traffic controller's observation was more perceptive than most of the opinions she'd heard from squadron personnel, but it still missed the fundamental truth about combat effectiveness. The edge Williams mentioned wasn't something that could be taught in classroom settings or developed through repeated training exercises. It was forged in the crucible of actual combat, where mistakes weren't learning opportunities, but death sentences. The radio chatter continued as the training exercise progressed, filled with the casual banter and technical jargon that characterized peacetime military operations. Sarah listened to each transmission with the focused attention of someone who understood that Communication discipline could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The young pilot's tendency to treat radio frequencies as social media platforms would have horrified the combat veterans who had trained her decades earlier. "Tower, this is Viper." Thompson's voice crackled through the speakers with barely contained excitement. "Just scored a simulated kill on Hotshot. Guess the old-timer watching from the tower. Got to see what real air-to-air combat looks like." Her comment was followed by good-natured ribbing from the other pilots, but Sarah detected the underlying competitiveness that drove most successful fighter pilots. The training exercise continued throughout the morning, with aircraft rotating through various tactical scenarios designed to prepare them for potential combat situations. Sarah watched each engagement with the analytical precision of someone who had participated in similar exercises when the stakes were measured in actual lives rather than training scores. The pilots' technical skills were impressive, but their tactical understanding remained dangerously shallow. As the morning wore on, Sarah began to notice subtle changes in the radio chatter that suggested the pilots were becoming increasingly conscious of her presence in the tower. Their comments about civilian observers and old-timers became more frequent and pointed, as if they were performing for her benefit rather than focusing on their training objectives. The behavior concerned her because it indicated a fundamental misunderstanding of what professionalism meant in military aviation. The desert sun reached its zenith as the training exercise concluded, and the various aircraft began their return to base. Sarah closed her logbook and prepared to leave the tower, knowing that her observations would be filed away and largely ignored by the squadron leadership. But she also knew that the young pilot's attitudes and assumptions would eventually be tested in ways that would reveal the true cost of their overconfidence. As she gathered her belongings and prepared to descend the tower stairs, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the storm she'd been anticipating was drawing closer. The question wasn't whether these young pilots would face a real test of their abilities. It was whether they would survive the experience that would force them to confront everything they thought they knew about combat, age, and what it truly meant to be a warrior in the unforgiving arena of aerial warfare. The squadron ready room at Nellis Air Force Base buzzed with the post-flight energy that always followed training exercises. Pilots still high on adrenaline as they debriefed their simulated combat encounters. The room itself was a testament to fighter pilot culture, its walls covered with unit patches, aircraft photos, and the kind of motivational posters that spoke to the aggressive mindset required for air-to-air combat. Sarah McKenzie sat in her designated corner, a small folding table that had been grudgingly provided for her use, reviewing the morning's observations while the real pilots conducted their official debrief. Lieutenant Rodriguez dominated the conversation, his voice carrying the particular brand of enthusiasm that comes from believing you've just performed brilliantly in front of an audience. "Did you see that vertical reversal I pulled during the third engagement? Textbook execution, exactly like they teach in the Advanced Fighter Tactics course." He gestured dramatically with his hands, recreating the maneuver for his squadron mates, who nodded appreciatively at his description. "Pretty impressive flying, Hotshot," agreed Lieutenant Chen, though his tone carried a slight edge of competitiveness. "Of course, I managed to get tone on you twice during that same sequence. Might want to work on your situational awareness before bragging too much." The comment drew laughter from the assembled pilots, but Sarah noticed the underlying tension. That suggested these young aviators were more concerned with impressing each other than analyzing their actual performance. Major Harrison entered the ready room, carrying a stack of evaluation forms and training scores that would determine squadron rankings for the next quarter. His weathered face showed the strain of managing pilots who possessed exceptional technical skills, but lacked the mature judgment that came from actual combat experience. "All right, people, gather around for the official debrief. We've got some areas that need improvement before our next evaluation cycle." The pilots arranged themselves in a rough semicircle around Harrison's position, their body language reflecting the casual confidence that characterized peacetime military operations. Sarah remained at her corner table, close enough to observe, but far enough away to maintain the fiction that she was merely a civilian observer rather than someone conducting her own evaluation of squadron readiness. Overall performance was solid. Harrison began, consulting his notes from the morning's exercise. Technical execution was good, but I'm seeing some concerning trends in tactical decision-making. Too much showboating, not enough focus on mission objectives. His comment was clearly directed at Rodriguez, whose tendency toward flashy maneuvers had become a source of ongoing concern among the squadron. Leadership. Lieutenant Thompson raised her hand with the aggressive confidence that had made her one of the squadron's most successful training pilots. With respect, Major, I think we're being overly cautious in our approach. Modern fighter aircraft are incredibly capable, and our training has prepared us for any threats we're likely to face. Maybe it's time to trust in our abilities rather than constantly second-guessing our instincts. The comment revealed the fundamental disconnect between Thompson's generation of pilots and the combat veterans who had trained their predecessors. Sarah's pen paused in its note-taking as she recognized the dangerous overconfidence that had gotten countless young aviators killed throughout military history. Thompson's assumption that training adequately prepared pilots for combat was both understandable and potentially fatal. That's exactly the kind of thinking that concerns me, Harrison replied, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed the consequences of pilot overconfidence firsthand. Confidence is essential, but it needs to be tempered with respect for the enemy's capabilities. The moment we start believing our own press releases is the moment we set ourselves up for disaster. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair with a dismissive gesture that suggested Harrison's concerns were overwrought. Come on, Major, we're not exactly facing top-tier opposition out there. Most of our potential adversaries are flying aircraft that were obsolete when our parents were in diapers. Our technological advantages are so overwhelming that tactical subtlety is probably unnecessary. The young pilot's assessment of enemy capabilities was both typical of his generation and completely wrong in ways that would have been obvious to anyone with actual combat experience. Sarah's expression remained neutral, but her fingers tightened around her pen as she listened to Rodriguez casually dismiss threats that could prove lethal to unprepared pilots. Technology is just a tool, Harrison responded, his voice carrying a note of frustration that suggested this conversation had occurred multiple times before. It's the person using that tool who determines whether it's effective or not. Over-reliance on technological advantages has gotten more pilots killed than mechanical failures ever have. Lieutenant Santos, the squadron's intelligence officer, entered the ready room carrying a folder of classified briefing materials that would update the pilots on current threat assessments. Her expression was more serious than usual, suggesting that the intelligence reports contained information that would challenge the squadron's casual assumptions about enemy capabilities. Sorry to interrupt the debrief, Major, but we've received some updated intelligence that might be relevant to today's discussion, Santos announced, her voice carrying the professional tension that characterized classified briefings. It seems our assumptions about enemy aircraft capabilities may need some revision. The pilot's attention sharpened as Santos opened her folder and began distributing briefing materials marked with security classifications that most of them had never seen before. Sarah watched the proceedings with the detached interest of someone who had received similar briefings countless times, but she noticed that the young aviator's body language had shifted from casual confidence to focused attention. Intelligence sources indicate that potential adversaries have been upgrading their aircraft with advanced avionics and weapon systems. Santos continued, her voice maintaining the neutral tone required for classified briefings. Their pilots have also been receiving enhanced training from experienced combat veterans who who understand how to exploit the weaknesses in our standard tactical approaches. The information clearly unsettled the younger pilots, whose assumptions about technological superiority had formed the foundation of their tactical confidence. Rodriguez's earlier dismissal of enemy capabilities seemed less convincing in light of Santos's briefing, but his response revealed the stubborn overconfidence that characterized his generation. Even with upgraded equipment, they're still dealing with fundamental limitations in pilot training and tactical doctrine, Rodriguez insisted, his voice carrying less conviction than before. Our pilots receive the best training in the world, and our aircraft are still generations ahead of anything they can field. I'm not seeing how this changes our basic assessment of the threat environment. Thompson nodded in agreement, her aggressive confidence apparently unshaken by the intelligence update. Besides, these reports are probably exaggerated to justify increased defense spending. You know how intelligence agencies like to inflate threats to support their budget requests. I doubt we're facing anything that would seriously challenge our capabilities. Sarah's pen moved across her notepad with quick, precise strokes as she recorded the pilots' responses to the intelligence briefing. Their casual dismissal of potential threats was exactly the kind of attitude that had concerned her since beginning her assignment at Nellis. These young aviators possessed impressive technical skills, but they lacked the hard-earned wisdom that came from understanding how quickly tactical situations could deteriorate. Major Harrison's expression showed the strain of trying to balance his pilot's confidence with the realities of modern air combat. I want everyone to take this intelligence seriously, he announced, his voice carrying the authority of his rank. Underestimating enemy capabilities is one of the fastest ways to get yourself killed in air-to-air combat. We need to adjust our training scenarios to account for these new threat assessments. The pilots' responses to Harrison's directive were polite, but clearly unenthusiastic. Their body language suggested they viewed the intelligence update as another example of leadership overreaction, rather than a genuine cause for concern. Sarah recognized the pattern from her own early career, when young pilots consistently underestimated threats until harsh experience taught them otherwise. Major, with respect, I think we might be overreacting to intelligence reports that are probably based on worst-case scenarios. Shun interjected, his voice carrying the confident dismissal that characterized most of the squadron's responses to warnings about enemy capabilities. Our training exercises consistently demonstrate our superiority over any realistic opposition. Maybe we should focus on maintaining our current level of readiness rather than chasing phantom threats. The comment drew supportive murmurs from several other pilots, who clearly shared Chun's assessment of the situation. Sarah watched the exchange with the detached interest of someone who had witnessed similar debates countless times throughout her career. The young aviators' confidence in their abilities was admirable, but it was based on peacetime exercises rather than the harsh realities of actual combat. I've been flying fighters for 15 years, Thompson added, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had excelled in every training scenario she'd encountered. I've seen every tactical situation the enemy could possibly throw at us, and I'm confident in our ability to handle whatever develops. Maybe it's time to trust in our training and stop looking for problems that don't exist. Sarah's expression remained impassive, but her mind was already analyzing the tactical implications of the pilot's attitudes. Thompson's 15 years of experience consisted entirely of training exercises in peacetime operations, giving her no basis for understanding how enemy pilots might exploit the overconfidence she was displaying. The young aviator's assumption that training scenarios accurately reflected combat realities was both understandable and potentially lethal. The debrief continued for another 30 minutes, with Harrison struggling to balance his pilot's confidence with the need to prepare them for emerging threats. The intelligence update had clearly unsettled some of the younger aviators, but their responses suggested they viewed the warnings as abstract concerns rather than immediate challenges to their tactical assumptions. As the meeting concluded, and The pilots began filing out of the ready room. Sarah overheard fragments of conversation that revealed their true feelings about the intelligence briefing. The consensus seemed to be that leadership was overreacting to exaggerated threats, and that their current training adequately prepared them for any realistic combat scenario. The attitude concerned Sarah because it reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how air combat actually worked. These young pilots had never experienced the gut-wrenching reality of facing an enemy who was actively trying to kill them, and their confidence was based on simulated encounters where the stakes were measured in training scores rather than human lives. As she gathered her notes and prepared to leave the ready room, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the squadron's overconfidence was about to be tested in ways that would reveal the true cost of their assumptions. The intelligence briefing had hinted at threats that would require every ounce of skill and experience these pilots possessed, but their casual dismissal of those warnings suggested they weren't prepared for the harsh realities that lay ahead. Officers' Club at Nellis Air Force Base served as the squadron's unofficial headquarters for after-hours discussions, its dimly lit interior providing a comfortable setting where pilots could decompress from the day's training while engaging in the kind of casual conversation that revealed their true attitudes about flying and combat. Sarah McKenzie sat alone at a corner table, nursing a cup of coffee that had grown cold, while she observed the interactions between the younger aviators, who dominated the establishment's evening clientele. Her choice of seating position wasn't accidental. The corner table provided an excellent vantage point for observing without being observed, a skill she'd developed during decades of intelligence gathering in far more dangerous environments. The worn leather briefcase beside her chair contained evaluation reports that would eventually make their way to Pentagon officials, but the real intelligence she was gathering came from listening to unguarded conversations between pilots who assumed their elderly observer was too naive to understand the significance of what they were discussing. Lieutenant Rodriguez held court at the bar, his animated gestures and rising voice indicating that he'd had enough alcohol to loosen his tongue considerably. "You should have seen the look on that civilian's face when I pulled that vertical climb during today's exercise," he boasted to his assembled audience. "Probably the most impressive flying she's ever witnessed. I bet she's never been that close to real military aviation before." The comment drew appreciative laughter from his squadron mates, but Sarah noticed the underlying insecurity that drove Rodriguez's need for constant validation. His assumption that she was impressed by routine training maneuvers revealed more about his own inexperience than her supposed naivety. Real combat pilots didn't need to perform for civilian observers. They focused on mission accomplishment. Regardless of who was watching, Lieutenant Thompson approached Rodriguez's group with the aggressive confidence that had made her one of the squadron's most decorated training pilots. "Speaking of our observer, has anyone actually bothered to find out what her background is? I mean, what qualifies someone to evaluate fighter pilot performance if they've never been in a cockpit themselves?" Her question carried the dismissive tone that characterized most of the squadron's discussions about Sarah's presence. "Probably some Pentagon desk jockey who thinks reading reports makes her an expert on air combat," suggested Lieutenant Chun, his voice carrying the particular brand of arrogance that came from excelling in controlled training environments. "You know how these civilian contractors work. They get hired based on their security clearance rather than their actual knowledge of the subject matter." Sarah's fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup as she listened to the pilot's speculation about her background. Their assumptions were both understandable and completely wrong, but revealing the truth would have defeated the entire purpose of her carefully constructed cover identity. She'd spent months building the persona of a mild-mannered civilian observer whose opinions could be safely ignored by the squadron's leadership. Major Harrison entered the officers' club with the weary expression of someone who had spent the day trying to manage pilots whose confidence exceeded their wisdom. His weathered face showed the strain of balancing his squadron's training requirements with the emerging threats outlined in the morning's intelligence briefing. He approached the bar with the deliberate pace of someone who needed alcohol to dull the edge of his professional concerns. "Evening, Major," Rodriguez called out with the casual familiarity that characterized peacetime military relationships. "Join us for a drink and some debriefing on today's exercise. We were just discussing our civilian observer and wondering what she actually thinks about our flying." The invitation carried an undercurrent of mockery that suggested the pilots viewed Sarah's evaluations as entertainment rather than professional assessment. Harrison accepted a beer from the bartender and took a position where he could observe both his pilots and Sarah's corner table. His expression suggested he was more aware of the dynamics at play than his subordinates realized, but he chose to maintain the fiction that Sarah was merely a harmless bureaucrat rather than someone whose opinions might actually matter. "She seemed to be taking plenty of notes during today's exercise," Harrison observed, his voice carefully neutral. "I'm curious about her assessment of our performance, but I suppose civilian observers see things differently than military professionals." The comment was clearly intended for Sarah's benefit, another example of the squadron's tendency to discuss her as if she weren't present. Thompson's voice carried a sharp edge as she responded to Harrison's observation. "With respect, Major, I'm not sure why we should care about civilian opinions on military operations. Our performance should be evaluated by people who actually understand what we're doing up there, not by someone whose only qualification is probably a college degree in some unrelated field." The young pilot's dismissal of civilian expertise was typical of her generation's attitude toward non-military personnel. But Sarah recognized the deeper insecurity that drove Thompson's need to devalue outside perspectives. Truly confident professionals welcomed evaluation from any source that might help them improve, while insecure ones dismissed criticism to protect their fragile self-image. "You know what bothers me most about having civilians evaluate our performance?" Chun interjected, his voice rising slightly as the alcohol began to affect his judgment. "They don't understand the split-second decision-making that defines air combat. They see us pull a maneuver and think they can judge whether it was appropriate, but they have no idea what it feels like to make those decisions under pressure." Sarah's pale blue eyes flicked toward Chun momentarily before returning to her coffee. The young pilot's assumption that she didn't understand pressure or split-second decision-making was both amusing and tragic. She'd made decisions under pressure that would have paralyzed most people, but revealing that experience would have compromised the intelligence-gathering mission that had brought her to Nellis in the first place. "I heard she used to work for some defense contractor," Rodriguez added, his voice carrying the dismissive tone that characterized most of the squadron's discussions about civilian personnel. "Probably spent her career analyzing data rather than actually flying. No wonder she seems so out of place around real aircraft and pilots." The speculation about Sarah's background continued as the evening progressed, with each pilot contributing their own theory about her qualifications and motivations. Their assumptions ranged from mundane to ridiculous, but all of them shared the common thread of dismissing her as someone whose opinions were irrelevant to their professional development. Senior Master Sergeant Williams entered the officers' club with the confident stride of someone who had earned his place through decades of dedicated service. His presence commanded respect from the younger pilots, who recognized that his experience with air traffic control operations gave him unique insights into pilot performance and tactical decision-making. "Evening, Sergeant," Harrison called out, gesturing for Williams to join their group. "We were just discussing our civilian observer and wondering what she actually thinks about our flying. You've been working with her in the tower. What's your assessment of her qualifications?" Williams accepted a beer and considered his response carefully before speaking. "She's certainly observant," he acknowledged, his voice carrying the measured tone that characterized career military professionals. "Takes more notes than most civilian observers I've worked with. But I'm not sure what practical use those notes serve if she doesn't understand the technical aspects of what she's observing." The comment revealed Williams's own assumptions about Sarah's background, but Sarah noticed that his assessment was more nuanced than the pilot's casual dismissal. The senior sergeant's experience had taught him to be cautious about underestimating people, even if he didn't fully understand their capabilities. "Maybe she's writing a book or something," Thompson suggested with a laugh that carried no genuine humor. "You know how civilians love to romanticize military operations. Probably planning to write some thriller novel about fighter pilots and needs realistic details to make it believable." The suggestion drew appreciative chuckles from the assembled pilots, but Sarah recognized the underlying nervousness that drove their need to explain away her presence. Professional aviators who were genuinely confident in their abilities didn't spend their off-duty hours speculating about civilian observers. They focused on improving their own performance, regardless of who was watching. "I still think it's insulting to have our performance evaluated by someone who's never been in a cockpit," Rodriguez declared, his voice carrying the particular brand of indignation that came from wounded pride. "Military aviation is too complex and demanding to be understood by people who've never experienced it firsthand. We might as well ask a kindergarten teacher to evaluate our tactical decision-making." The comparison was both crude and revealing, suggesting that Rodriguez viewed military aviation as an exclusive club whose mysteries were incomprehensible to outsiders. Sarah's expression remained impassive, but her mind was already analyzing the tactical implications of his attitude. Pilots who believed their profession was too complex for outside evaluation were usually the ones who made the most basic mistakes under pressure. "You know what really gets me?" Chun added, his voice rising as the alcohol continued to affect his judgment. "She sits there taking notes like she's some kind of expert, but I bet she's never even been in a small aircraft, much less a fighter jet. How can someone who's probably afraid of flying evaluate the performance of combat pilots?" The assumption that Sarah was afraid of flying was so far from the truth that it was almost absurd, but she maintained her neutral expression while continuing to observe the pilots' interactions. Their need to diminish her credibility revealed more about their own insecurities than any deficiencies in her qualifications. As the evening progressed, the pilots' conversation shifted from speculation about Sarah's background to more general discussions about military aviation and their own career aspirations. But their earlier comments had revealed the fundamental attitudes that would shape their response to any future crisis. They viewed themselves as members of an elite profession that couldn't be understood or evaluated by outsiders, the officers. Club began to empty as the evening wore on, pilots gradually departing for their quarters to prepare for the next day's training exercises. Sarah remained at her corner table, finishing her cold coffee while reviewing the mental notes she'd taken during the evening's conversations. The intelligence she'd gathered would be invaluable for assessing squadron readiness, but it also revealed troubling patterns that suggested these young aviators were unprepared for the harsh realities of actual combat. Thompson was among the last to leave, her departure preceded by a final comment that summarized the squadron's attitude toward civilian oversight. "At least we don't have to worry about her opinions affecting our careers," she declared to her remaining companions. "Pentagon officials know the difference between real expertise and civilian speculation. Our performance speaks for itself." The comment would prove to be prophetic in ways that Thompson couldn't possibly imagine, but not in the manner she intended. Sarah's performance evaluations would indeed speak for themselves, but the message they conveyed would be very different from what the young pilot expected. As she gathered her belongings and prepared to leave the officers' club, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the squadron's overconfidence was about to be tested in ways that would reveal the true cost of their assumptions about age, experience, and what it meant to be a warrior in the unforgiving arena of aerial combat. The intelligence briefing room at Nellis Air Force Base buzzed with urgent activity as classified reports streamed in from multiple sources along the eastern seaboard. Sarah McKenzie sat in her usual position at the back of the room, her notebook balanced on her lap as she observed the growing tension among squadron personnel who were beginning to realize that their assumptions about enemy capabilities might have been dangerously optimistic. Colonel James Hawk Morrison, the base commander, entered the briefing room with the grim expression of someone who had just received information that would fundamentally alter his unit's mission parameters. His weathered face, marked by 30 years of military service, showed the strain of processing intelligence reports that challenged every assumption his pilots had made about the current threat environment. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a developing situation that requires immediate attention," Morrison announced, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that commanded instant focus from everyone present. "Intelligence sources have confirmed unusual aircraft movements along our eastern border, and we're being tasked with providing enhanced readiness posture effective immediately." The assembled pilots exchanged glances that reflected a mixture of excitement and concern. For most of them, the prospect of transitioning from training exercises to actual operational missions represented the culmination of their professional preparation. But Sarah noticed subtle signs of nervousness that suggested their confidence was beginning to waver. Lieutenant Rodriguez leaned forward in his chair with the eager anticipation of someone who had been waiting for an opportunity to prove his worth in a real-world scenario. "Sir, what kind of aircraft are we talking about? Are these the same upgraded platforms mentioned in yesterday's intelligence briefing?" His question carried the professional interest that characterized pilots who took their responsibilities seriously, but Sarah detected underlying assumptions that would prove problematic. "The aircraft in question represent a significant advancement over previous threat assessments," Morrison replied, consulting the classified documents spread across the briefing room table. "We're dealing with upgraded avionics, enhanced weapons systems, and pilots who have received extensive training from experienced combat veterans. This is not the same opposition we've been preparing for in our standard training scenarios." The revelation clearly unsettled several of the younger pilots, whose confidence had been built on assumptions about technological superiority that were rapidly proving inadequate. Sarah watched their body language shift from casual confidence to focused attention as the implications of Morrison's briefing began to sink in. "Lieutenant," Thompson raised her hand with the aggressive determination that had made her one of the squadron's most successful training pilots. "Colonel, even with upgraded equipment, we still maintain significant advantages in terms of aircraft performance and pilot training. Our F-16s are proven combat platforms, and our pilots have received the best preparation in the world. I'm confident we can handle whatever develops." The comment revealed Thompson's fundamental misunderstanding of how air combat actually worked, but Sarah remained silent while observing the colonel's response. Morrison's expression suggested he was struggling to balance his pilot's confidence with the realities outlined in the intelligence reports he'd been reviewing. "Confidence is essential, Lieutenant, but it needs to be tempered with respect for enemy capabilities," Morrison replied, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed the consequences of pilot overconfidence firsthand. "These aren't the same adversaries we've been training against, and their pilots aren't the inexperienced aviators we've been led to expect." Major Harrison entered the briefing room carrying additional intelligence materials that would update the squadron's threat assessment based on the latest reconnaissance data. His expression was more serious than usual, suggesting that the new information contained details that would challenge even the most optimistic projections about enemy capabilities. "Sir, we've received updated intelligence from reconnaissance flights conducted over the past 48 hours, Harrison announced, his voice carrying the professional tension that characterized classified briefings. "The enemy aircraft we're tracking demonstrate flight characteristics that suggest their pilots possess significant combat experience." The information sent a visible ripple of concern through the assembled pilots, who had built their tactical confidence on assumptions about enemy inexperience that were rapidly proving incorrect. Sarah noticed that several of the younger aviators were beginning to show signs of the nervousness that characterized pilots who were realizing their training might not have prepared them for the challenges they were about to face. "What kind of flight characteristics are we talking about?" asked Lieutenant Chun, his voice carrying less of the casual confidence that had characterized his earlier comments. "Are we dealing with pilots who have actual combat experience, or just enhanced training programs?" Morrison's response was delivered with the careful precision of someone who understood that the information he was sharing would fundamentally alter his pilots' understanding of the tactical environment they were about to enter. Intelligence analysis suggests these pilots have extensive experience with air-to-air combat, including engagements against NATO aircraft. We're not dealing with novices who can be easily outmaneuvered through superior technology. The revelation hit the squadron like a physical blow, challenging every assumption they had made about their own superiority and the enemy's capabilities. Sarah watched the pilots' faces as they processed the implications of Morrison's briefing, noting the subtle signs of fear that were beginning to replace their earlier confidence. "With respect, sir, I think we might be overestimating enemy capabilities based on limited intelligence," Rodriguez interjected, his voice carrying the stubborn overconfidence that had characterized his response to previous warnings. "Our training has prepared us for any realistic threat scenario, and our aircraft maintain significant technological advantages that should compensate for any pilot experience differential." The young aviator's response revealed his inability to grasp the fundamental truth about air combat, that pilot skill and experience often trumped technological advantages in actual combat situations. Sarah recognized the pattern from her own early career, when young pilots consistently underestimated human factors until harsh experience taught them otherwise. "Lieutenant, I want you to understand something about combat aviation," Morrison replied, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned hard lessons about the realities of aerial warfare. "Technology is just a tool, and it's only as effective as the person using it. Overconfidence in technological superiority has gotten more pilots killed than mechanical failures ever have." The colonel's warning was clearly directed at the entire squadron, but Sarah noticed that several of the younger pilots were still struggling to accept the possibility that their training might not have prepared them for the challenges they were about to face. Their body language suggested they viewed Morrison's concerns as excessive caution rather than prudent preparation. "Sir, what are our rules of engagement for this enhanced readiness posture?" asked Lieutenant Santos, the squadron's intelligence officer, her voice carrying the professional focus that characterized experienced military personnel. "Are we operating under peacetime constraints, or should we prepare for potential combat situations?" Morrison's response was delivered with the gravity of someone who understood that the rules of engagement would determine whether his pilots lived or died in the encounters that lay ahead. "Rules of engagement are classified, but I want everyone to understand that we're not dealing with a training exercise. The aircraft we're tracking represent genuine threats to American airspace, and our response protocols reflect that reality." The briefing continued for another hour as additional intelligence reports arrived from various sources, each one adding new details about enemy capabilities that further challenged the squadron's assumptions. Sarah watched the pilots' confidence erode as they realized that their peacetime training might not have prepared them for the harsh realities of actual combat. "I want everyone to understand that this is not a drill," Morrison announced as the briefing concluded. "The threats we're facing are real, and the consequences of failure are measured in lives rather than training scores. I need every pilot to approach this mission with the seriousness it deserves." The colonel's warning was met with solemn nods from the assembled pilots, but Sarah noticed that several of them were still struggling to reconcile their peacetime confidence with the emerging realities of the tactical situation. Their body language suggested they were beginning to understand that their assumptions about enemy capabilities had been dangerously optimistic. As the pilots filed out of the briefing room, Sarah overheard fragments of conversation that revealed their growing anxiety about the challenges they were about to face. The casual confidence that had characterized their earlier discussions had been replaced by nervous speculation about enemy capabilities and the adequacy of their own preparation. "I never expected to face pilots with actual combat experience," Shun whispered to Rodriguez as they left the briefing room. "Our training scenarios always assumed we'd be dealing with inexperienced adversaries who could be easily outmaneuvered. This changes everything." The comment revealed Chun's growing understanding of the gap between training exercises and actual combat. But Sarah recognized that intellectual awareness was very different from the emotional preparation required for life-and-death encounters. These young pilots were about to discover that knowing about combat and experiencing it were completely different things. "Maybe we should have paid more attention to those intelligence briefings," Rodriguez replied, his voice carrying the first hints of genuine concern that Sarah had heard from him. "I'm starting to think our confidence might have been based on incomplete information about what we're actually facing." The conversation continued as the pilots dispersed to prepare for the enhanced readiness posture that would define their operations for the foreseeable future. Sarah remained in the briefing room, reviewing her notes while considering the implications of what she had observed. The squadron's overconfidence was finally being challenged by external realities, but she wondered whether the adjustment would come soon enough to prevent the kind of catastrophic mistakes that could prove fatal in actual combat. As she gathered her materials and prepared to leave the briefing room, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the storm she had been anticipating was finally beginning to break. The intelligence reports suggested that these young pilots were about to face challenges that would test every assumption they had made about their own capabilities and the nature of aerial combat. The question wasn't whether they would survive the experience, it was whether they would learn from it quickly enough to avoid the kind of tragic mistakes that had claimed countless young aviators throughout military history. The klaxon alarm pierced the pre-dawn stillness at Nellis Air Force Base with the urgent wail that meant only one thing: this was not a drill. Sarah McKenzie was already awake in her temporary quarters, having spent the night reviewing classified intelligence reports that suggested the enhanced readiness posture was about to transition from theoretical preparation to actual combat operations. The sound of running feet and shouted commands echoed through the corridors as pilots scrambled to respond to what would prove to be the most significant test of their careers. The alert facility buzzed with frantic activity as squadron personnel rushed to don their flight gear and prepare for immediate launch. Sarah arrived at the operations center to find chaos barely contained by military discipline, with air traffic controllers coordinating multiple aircraft launches while intelligence officers provided real-time updates on the developing situation. The atmosphere was electric with tension as months of peacetime routine gave way to the harsh realities of potential combat. "All pilots to the briefing room immediately," Major Harrison's voice boomed over the facility's public address system, his tone carrying the urgency that characterized genuine emergency situations. "We have multiple bogies approaching restricted airspace, and we're launching immediate intercept missions. This is not a training exercise. Repeat, this is not a training exercise." The assembled pilots filed into the briefing room with expressions that ranged from excitement to barely concealed fear. Sarah positioned herself at her usual observation point, noting how the young aviator's body language had changed from the casual confidence of previous briefings to the focused tension of professionals who were beginning to understand that their lives might depend on the next few hours. Colonel Morrison entered the briefing room with the grim determination of a commander who had just received intelligence that would fundamentally alter his unit's mission parameters. His weathered face showed the strain of processing multiple threat assessments while coordinating with higher headquarters about rules of Engagement and tactical priorities. Gentlemen and ladies, we have 6 unidentified aircraft approaching our airspace at high speed and altitude, Morrison announced, his voice cutting through the nervous chatter that had filled the room. Intelligence indicates these are the upgraded platforms we've been tracking, and their flight profile suggests hostile intent. We're launching immediate intercept missions with orders to identify and, if necessary, engage. The revelation that they were facing potential combat rather than another training exercise sent a visible shock through the assembled pilots. Sarah watched their faces as they processed the implications of Morrison's briefing, noting the subtle signs of panic that were beginning to replace their earlier confidence. Lieutenant Rodriguez raised his hand with less of the eager enthusiasm that had characterized his previous questions. Sir, what are our specific rules of engagement? Are we authorized to fire if the boogies demonstrate hostile intent, or are we restricted to visual identification only? His voice carried the professional concern of someone who was beginning to understand that split-second decisions might determine whether he lived or died. Rules of engagement are weapons-free if bogies demonstrate hostile intent, Morrison replied, his tone carrying the gravity of someone who understood that he was potentially sending young pilots into mortal combat. But I want everyone to understand that these aren't training targets. They're piloted by experienced aviators who will be actively trying to kill you. Every decision you make up there needs to account for that reality. The colonel's warning was met with solemn nods from the assembled pilots, but Sarah noticed that several of them were still struggling to reconcile their peacetime mindset with the emerging realities of actual combat. Their body language suggested they were beginning to understand that their assumptions about enemy capabilities had been dangerously optimistic. The launch sequence will be 4 ship formations with standard combat loads, Harrison announced, consulting the tactical display that showed the approaching threats. Rodriguez and Thompson will lead the primary intercept, with Chen and Wilson providing backup. Remember, these pilots have combat experience. Don't underestimate their capabilities. The pilots began filing out of the briefing room toward the flight line, their earlier casual conversation replaced by the focused silence of professionals who were preparing for potentially lethal encounters. Sarah followed at a distance, her position as civilian observer allowing her to witness the pre-flight preparations that would determine whether these young aviators survived their first taste of real combat. The flight line resembled a carefully choreographed ballet as ground crews prepared the F-16s for immediate launch. Sarah watched Rodriguez and Thompson complete their pre-flight inspections with the methodical precision that characterized well-trained pilots, but she noticed subtle signs of nervousness that suggested their confidence was beginning to waver. Under the pressure of impending combat, ready for this hotshot? Thompson called out to Rodriguez as they approached their respective aircraft, her voice carrying forced bravado that didn't quite conceal her underlying anxiety. Time to show these mystery pilots what real fighter jocks can do. Rodriguez's response was more subdued than his usual confident declarations. Just remember what they said about these guys having combat experience. We need to be smart about this, not just aggressive. His comment revealed a growing maturity that suggested the intelligence briefings had begun to penetrate his earlier overconfidence. The aircraft engines roared to life with the familiar scream of turbofan power plants spinning up to operational parameters. Sarah watched the pilots complete their final systems checks while ground crews removed safety pins and prepared the aircraft for immediate launch. The controlled chaos of combat preparation was something she had witnessed countless times, but always from the perspective of someone who would be climbing into a cockpit rather than observing from the ground. Tower, this is Viper Flight requesting immediate takeoff clearance. Thompson's voice crackled through the control frequency, her professional tone masking the nervous energy that characterized pilots preparing for their first real combat mission. We're loaded and ready for intercept operations. The air traffic controllers responded with the crisp efficiency that characterized emergency operations, clearing the four-ship formation for immediate departure while providing initial vectors toward the approaching threat. Sarah watched the F-16s accelerate down the runway with afterburners blazing, their departure marking the transition from peacetime training to actual combat operations. The control tower became a hub of intense activity as radar operators tracked both friendly and hostile aircraft while coordinating with higher headquarters about the developing situation. Sarah positioned herself where she could observe the tactical display, while listening to radio communications that would determine whether Rodriguez and Thompson survived their encounter with experienced enemy pilots. Viper flight, this is Overlord. The controller's voice carried the tension that characterized genuine combat operations. Bogies are bearing 090 at Angels 25, speed 500 knots. Be advised, these contacts are not responding to standard identification queries and are maintaining course toward restricted airspace. The pilot's acknowledgement of the tactical update was professional but tense, reflecting their growing understanding that they were about to face the kind of opposition that could exploit any mistakes in their training or judgment. Sarah listened to their radio communications with the analytical precision of someone who understood that pilot performance under pressure revealed more about their capabilities than any peacetime exercise. Viper 1 has visual contact, Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying the focused intensity that characterized pilots who had just spotted potential threats. Multiple contacts at our 11 o'clock position. Appears to be 6 aircraft in loose formation. They're not squawking identification codes and are maintaining an aggressive flight profile. The enemy aircraft's refusal to respond to standard identification procedures was a clear indication of hostile intent, but Sarah noticed that Rodriguez's radio communications still carried the professional restraint that characterized pilots who had never faced mortal combat. His training had prepared him for this moment, but actual experience would determine whether that preparation was adequate. Viper 2, I'm getting electronic emissions that suggest advanced radar systems, Thompson reported, her voice carrying the first hints of genuine concern. These guys are painting us with targeting radars, and their aircraft appear to be carrying external weapons loads. This is definitely not a training exercise. The realization that they were facing armed opponents with advanced equipment sent a visible shock through the squadron personnel monitoring the radio communications. Sarah watched the tactical display as the two formations approached each other at a combined closing speed that would bring them into weapons range within minutes. All Viper aircraft, you are cleared to engage if bogies demonstrate hostile intent, the controller announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood that the rules of engagement had just shifted from identification to potential combat. Weapons are free. Repeat, weapons are free. The authorization to engage hostile aircraft marked the point of no return for pilots who had spent their entire careers preparing for this moment without ever experiencing the reality of mortal combat. Sarah watched the radar display as the two formations closed on each other, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether months of training had adequately prepared these young aviators for the harsh realities of aerial warfare. Radio crackled with tense communications as the opposing aircraft maneuvered for tactical advantage, each pilot trying to gain the positional superiority that would determine survival in the engagement that was about to unfold. Sarah recognized the tactical patterns from her own combat experience, but she also noticed subtle mistakes that suggested Rodriguez and Thompson were struggling to apply their training under the pressure of actual combat. The first missile launch lit up the morning sky like a deadly shooting star, its contrail marking the moment when theoretical combat training became a life-or-death reality. Sarah McKenzie watched the tactical display with the focused intensity of someone who had survived similar encounters, her trained eye immediately recognizing the superior positioning and timing that characterized the enemy's opening move. The Hostile aircraft had maneuvered Rodriguez and Thompson into a classic tactical trap, exploiting their inexperience with the kind of ruthless efficiency that only came from actual combat experience. Viper 1, missile in the air. Rodriguez's voice cracked through the radio with the panic that characterized pilots who had just realized their training hadn't prepared them for the reality of someone actively trying to kill them. His F-16 pulled into a desperate defensive turn, dispensing chaff and flares while trying to break the incoming missile's lock. The maneuver was textbook perfect from a technical standpoint, but his radio discipline had completely collapsed under the pressure of mortal combat. Sarah's pale blue eyes tracked the engagement on the radar display while her mind automatically calculated the tactical implications of what she was witnessing. The enemy pilots had used a coordinated approach that forced the younger aviators into defensive positions, negating their technological advantages through superior tactical awareness. Rodriguez's panicked response had revealed his position to the other hostile aircraft, who were already maneuvering to exploit his vulnerability. Viper 2, I'm engaged in defense. Thompson's voice carried the strained intensity of someone who had just discovered that her aggressive training persona was completely inadequate for actual combat. Her F-16 pulled vertically in an attempt to gain altitude advantage, but the maneuver exposed her aircraft's most vulnerable aspect to the enemy formation. The mistake was exactly the kind of tactical error that Sarah had observed during training exercises, but now it carried potentially fatal consequences. The missile Rodriguez had been evading detonated harmlessly after his countermeasures successfully broke its guidance lock, but the victory was short-lived. The enemy pilots had used the first launch as a distraction while positioning themselves for follow-up attacks that would exploit the defensive reactions they had forced. Sarah watched the tactical display as the hostile aircraft demonstrated the kind of coordinated teamwork that could only come from extensive combat experience. Overlord, this is Viper 1. Rodriguez's voice carried the desperate edge that characterized pilots who were beginning to understand they were outmatched. These guys are good, really good. They're using tactics I've never seen before, and they're working together like they've done this 1,000 times. His assessment was both accurate and terrifying, revealing the gap between training exercises and actual combat that no amount of peacetime preparation could bridge. The control tower erupted in controlled chaos as additional radar contacts appeared on the tactical display, indicating that the 6 hostile aircraft were part of a larger formation that had been concealed by electronic warfare measures. Sarah watched the scope as 12 additional contacts materialized at various altitudes and bearings, their positions suggesting a coordinated attack plan that would overwhelm the 4 American fighters through sheer numbers and tactical sophistication. All aircraft, we have additional bogies appearing on scope, the controller announced, his voice carrying the professional tension that characterized air traffic controllers, who were coordinating genuine combat operations. Count is now 18 hostile aircraft in multiple formations. Be advised, this appears to be a coordinated attack on our airspace. The revelation that they were facing 18 experienced enemy pilots sent a visible shock through the squadron. Personnel monitoring the engagement. Sarah noticed that several of the younger officers were beginning to show signs of panic as they realized their 4 pilots were facing odds that would challenge even the most experienced combat veterans. Viper 3 and 4, we need immediate support. Thompson's voice carried the desperate intensity of someone who had just realized that her flight was drastically outnumbered. Her earlier confidence had been replaced by the focused desperation of a pilot who was fighting for survival against overwhelming odds. We're being engaged by multiple aircraft with superior positioning and coordination. Lieutenant Chun's response revealed the growing panic that was beginning to affect the entire flight. Viper 4 is engaging, but these guys are using electronic warfare systems that are jamming our radar locks. I can't get a clean shot on any of them. His voice carried the frustration of someone who was discovering that technological advantages meant nothing when facing opponents who knew how to counter them. Sarah's mind raced through the tactical possibilities as she watched the engagement unfold on the radar display. The enemy formation was using a complex multi-layered attack that would systematically isolate and destroy each American aircraft through coordinated maneuvers that exploited every weakness in their training. The hostile pilots were demonstrating a level of tactical sophistication that suggested they had studied American fighter tactics extensively. "Mayday, mayday, this is Viper 2. Thompson's voice carried the panic that characterized pilots who were about to die. "I'm taking multiple missile shots from different directions. My countermeasures are depleted, and I'm running out of options." Her F-16 was pulling maximum G-forces in a series of defensive maneuvers that were burning fuel at an unsustainable rate. While failing to break free from the coordinated attack, the tactical display showed Thompson's aircraft surrounded by hostile contacts that were coordinating their attacks with the precision of a well-rehearsed ballet. Sarah recognized the pattern as a classic multiple-axis engagement designed to exhaust the defender's countermeasures while maintaining constant pressure from multiple directions. The enemy pilots were demonstrating exactly the kind of combat experience that the intelligence briefings had warned about. "Viper 1 is Winchester," Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying the desperation of someone who had just expended all his missiles without achieving a single kill. "I'm down to guns only, and these guys are staying outside my engagement envelope. They know exactly how to counter our tactics." His assessment revealed the harsh reality that their training had prepared them for opponents who would fight according to predictable patterns rather than experienced pilots who could adapt to any situation. The enemy aircraft were demonstrating a level of tactical flexibility that completely negated the American pilots' technological advantages. Sarah watched as they used electronic warfare systems to degrade the F-16's radar performance while maintaining perfect formation discipline that allowed them to coordinate attacks with devastating effectiveness. The hostile pilots were fighting like a single organism rather than individual aircraft, each one supporting the others in a display of teamwork that spoke to extensive combat experience. "Overlord, this is Viper Flight Leader," Rodriguez's voice carried the professional resignation of someone who was beginning to accept that his flight was about to be destroyed. "We need immediate reinforcement or we're going to lose this engagement. These pilots are operating at a level that's completely beyond our training experience." The admission that they were outmatched sent a shock through the control tower personnel who had been monitoring the engagement with growing horror. Sarah watched as the tactical display showed the American formation beginning to collapse under the coordinated pressure from 18 hostile aircraft that were demonstrating superior tactics, better coordination, and more experience than anything the young pilots had encountered in training. All stations, we have a flight of F-16s under attack by superior forces," the controller announced, his voice carrying the urgency that characterized genuine emergency situations. "We need immediate reinforcement, or we're going to lose 4 aircraft and pilots." The radio call was both a request for help and an acknowledgement that the situation had deteriorated beyond the capability of the engaged pilots to handle. Sarah's hands clenched into fists as she watched the tactical display show Thompson's aircraft beginning to trail smoke from what appeared to be battle damage. The young pilot's voice crackled through the radio with the strained intensity of someone who was fighting to keep a damaged aircraft airborne while still being pursued by multiple hostile contacts. "Viper 2 is hit. Repeat, Viper 2 is hit," Thompson reported, her voice carrying the focused calm that sometimes emerged in pilots who were facing imminent death. "I've got engine problems and flight control damage. I don't think I can maintain this much longer." Her aircraft was beginning to lose altitude while the enemy formation closed in for what appeared to be a coordinated finishing attack. The moment had arrived when months of peacetime confidence would be tested against the harsh reality of combat. Death. Sarah stood up from her observation position with the fluid grace of someone who had made a decision that would change everything. Her pale blue eyes had lost their mild civilian appearance, replaced by the steel-hard focus of someone who had survived air combat that these young pilots couldn't even imagine. "Tower, this is Phantom," she announced, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded respect in the most dangerous airspace in the world. "I'm requesting immediate clearance for combat launch. Those kids are about to die, and I'm the only one who can save them." The radio fell silent as everyone in the control tower turned to stare at the elderly civilian observer, who had just used a call sign that belonged to a legend they thought was dead. Sarah was already moving toward the flight line with the determined stride of someone who had spent 10 years preparing for this moment, knowing that the storm she had promised was finally about to break with the fury of a combat pilot who had never really stopped flying. The stunned silence in the control tower lasted exactly 3 seconds before Colonel Morrison's voice cut through the disbelief like a blade through silk. "Phantom?" he repeated, his weathered face going pale as memories from classified briefings flooded back. "That's impossible. Colonel Sarah McKenzie was reported missing in action over the Black Sea 10 years ago. She's been officially listed as presumed dead since 2014. Sarah was already striding toward the flight line with the purposeful gait of someone who had spent decades preparing for moments like this, her civilian clothes seeming suddenly incongruous with the military bearing that had emerged from beneath her carefully constructed facade. "Colonel, I've been very much alive and tracking enemy aircraft movements for the past decade. Those pilots up there are about to be killed by opponents who have been studying American tactics for years." The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled personnel who had spent months dismissing her as a harmless civilian observer. Major Harrison stared at her retreating form with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had just been shattered. "Sir, are you telling me that the woman we've been calling Grandma Mac is actually Colonel Sarah McKenzie, the most decorated female fighter pilot in Air Force history?" "Check the classified databases," Morrison ordered, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was beginning to piece together a puzzle that had been hidden in plain sight for months. "Cross-reference her biometric data with the personnel files from the 352nd Fighter Squadron. If this is really Sarah McKenzie, then those young pilots might actually have a chance of survival." Sarah reached the flight line where a maintenance crew was preparing a backup F-16 for potential launch, her trained eye immediately assessing the aircraft's combat readiness, while her mind calculated the tactical requirements for engaging 18 experienced enemy pilots. The maintenance chief, Technical Sergeant Rodriguez, looked up from his checklist with the confusion of someone who couldn't understand why a civilian was approaching his aircraft. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area," Rodriguez began, his voice carrying the polite firmness that characterized military personnel addressing civilians. "Only authorized flight personnel are allowed near operational aircraft." His expression showed the bewilderment of someone who was trying to reconcile Sarah's civilian appearance with the military confidence she was suddenly displaying. "Sergeant, I'm Colonel Sarah McKenzie, and I'm taking this aircraft," Sarah announced while conducting her own pre-flight inspection with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed similar procedures under combat conditions countless times. "Those pilots up there are about to die unless someone with actual combat experience intervenes immediately." The maintenance chief's jaw dropped as he processed the implications of what he was hearing. "Colonel McKenzie? But you're supposed to be dead, and you're—" He gestured helplessly at her civilian clothes and graying hair. "You're not exactly dressed for combat operations." Sarah was already climbing into the cockpit with the fluid grace of someone for whom the F-16's controls were as familiar as breathing. "Age is just a number, Sergeant, and experience doesn't fade with time. Get me a flight suit and helmet while I run through the systems check. Those kids have maybe 5 minutes before they're overwhelmed." The radio crackled with increasingly desperate communications from the embattled flight as Rodriguez and his crew watched Sarah's hands move across the F-16's instrument panel with the unconscious precision of someone who had logged thousands of combat hours. Her movements were economical and purposeful, lacking the hesitation that characterized pilots who were uncertain about their equipment. "Viper 2 is going down." Thompson's voice carried the panic of someone whose aircraft was failing under the stress of sustained combat maneuvering. "I've got multiple system failures and I'm losing altitude. These guys are coordinating their attacks like they've done this before." Her F-16 was streaming smoke from what appeared to be engine damage, while hostile aircraft closed in from multiple directions. Sarah's pale blue eyes hardened as she listened to the young pilot's distress call while completing her pre-flight checks with mechanical precision. The enemy formation was using advanced tactics that would systematically destroy each American aircraft through coordinated pressure that exploited every weakness in their training. The hostile pilots were demonstrating exactly the kind of combat experience that made them lethal opponents for inexperienced aviators. "Tower, this is Phantom requesting immediate combat launch," Sarah announced, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded respect in the most dangerous airspace in the world. "I'm fully qualified on this aircraft and currently on all combat procedures. Those pilots need immediate support, or they're going to die." Colonel Morrison's voice crackled through the radio with the tension of someone who was making a decision that would either save 4 pilots or cost the Air Force one of its most legendary aviators. "Phantom, be advised that you've been officially dead for 10 years. Your flight status is questionable, and you're engaging 18 hostile aircraft with superior positioning and coordination." Sarah's response was delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had faced similar odds and survived through superior skill rather than technological advantages. "Colonel, I've been tracking these particular pilots for 3 years. I know their tactics, their weaknesses, and exactly how to exploit their overconfidence. Clear me for immediate takeoff." The F-16's engine roared to life with the familiar scream of turbofan power spinning up to combat parameters, its sound drowning out the protests from ground personnel, who were struggling to process the reality that their elderly civilian observer was actually a combat legend preparing to engage superior enemy forces. Sarah's hands moved across the controls with the unconscious efficiency of someone for whom flying was as natural as walking. "Phantom, you're cleared for immediate takeoff," Morrison announced, his voice carrying the weight of someone who was betting 4 pilots' lives on a ghost who had been presumed dead for a decade. "Be advised, hostile aircraft are using electronic warfare systems that are degrading our pilots' radar performance. You're going into a furball with minimal support and maximum opposition." Sarah's F-16 accelerated down the runway with afterburner flames painting brilliant orange streaks against the morning sky. Her takeoff roll executed with the precision of someone who had performed similar procedures under combat conditions countless times. The aircraft lifted off with the predatory grace of a weapon system in the hands of someone who understood its capabilities intimately. "Viper flight, this is Phantom," Sarah announced as her aircraft climbed toward the ongoing engagement, her voice carrying the calm authority that had once struck fear into enemy pilots across 3 continents. "I'm en route to your position with full combat load. Maintain defensive posture until I arrive." The radio fell silent as the embattled pilots processed the impossibility of what they were hearing. Rodriguez's voice was the first to respond, carrying the disbelief of someone who was hearing a ghost speak through the radio. "Phantom, that's impossible. Colonel McKenzie has been missing for 10 years. Who is this?" "Lieutenant, this is the woman you've been calling Grandma Mac for the past 8 months," Sarah replied, her F-16 climbing at maximum rate while she armed her weapon systems with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed similar procedures under mortal pressure. I've been watching you train, and now I'm going to show you how someone with actual combat experience handles 18 hostile aircraft. The revelation sent shockwaves through the flight of young pilots who had spent months mocking the quiet civilian observer, who was now climbing toward their position with the confidence of someone who had survived air combat that would have killed lesser pilots. Thompson's voice carried the disbelief of someone whose entire worldview had just been shattered. "The old lady in the tower is Colonel Sarah McKenzie?" Thompson gasped, her damaged aircraft still being pursued by multiple hostile contacts. The same Colonel McKenzie who holds the record for most enemy aircraft destroyed in a single engagement. Sarah's response was delivered with the quiet intensity of someone who was about to demonstrate exactly why certain legends never really died. "That's correct, Lieutenant. Now watch carefully, because you're about to learn what real air combat looks like when someone with experience takes out opponents who think they're invincible." The F-16's radar display lit up with hostile contacts as Sarah approached the engagement area, her trained eye immediately analyzing the tactical situation that had nearly overwhelmed 4 young pilots. The enemy formation was using sophisticated coordination that would have challenged even experienced combat veterans. But Sarah had spent 10 years studying these particular opponents and knew exactly how to exploit their tactical assumptions. "Viper, flight, break defensive and follow my lead," Sarah commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to give orders through superior skill rather than higher rank. "I'm going to show these guys why they should never underestimate a pilot just because she's older than their aircraft." Sarah's F-16 sliced through the morning sky with the predatory efficiency of a weapon system in the hands of someone who understood aerial combat at a level that transcended mere training. Her first maneuver was a climbing spiral that brought her above the 18 hostile aircraft while simultaneously positioning her between the enemy formation and the damaged American fighters. The tactical positioning was so perfect that it appeared effortless, but the young pilots watching from below recognized the kind of three-dimensional thinking that only came from extensive combat experience. "Viper flight, reform on my 6 and prepare for coordinated attack," Sarah commanded, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had faced similar odds and survived through superior tactics rather than technological advantages. "These pilots are good, but they're operating according to predictable patterns that can be exploited by someone who understands their doctrine." The hostile aircraft immediately recognized the threat posed by Sarah's arrival, their formation shifting from pursuit configuration to defensive posture as they attempted to assess the capabilities of the new adversary. Their reaction time was impressive, but Sarah had anticipated their response and was already implementing a tactical sequence that would exploit their momentary confusion. "Phantom, you're outnumbered 6-1, Rodriguez's voice carried the concern of someone who was beginning to understand that their civilian observer possessed capabilities that defied explanation. "These guys have been coordinating their attacks like they've done this before. How are you planning to engage 18 experienced pilots?" Sarah's response was delivered while she executed a high G-turn that brought her F-16 into perfect firing position against the lead hostile aircraft. "Lieutenant, the key to defeating superior numbers is to force them into situations where they can't use their coordination effectively. Watch and learn." Her first missile launch was timed with surgical precision, targeting the enemy formation. Leader at a moment when his aircraft was transitioning between tactical maneuvers. The AM-12 Ram streaked through the sky with deadly accuracy, its advanced guidance system overwhelming the hostile pilot's countermeasures through superior positioning rather than technological superiority. The explosion lit up the morning sky as the enemy leader's aircraft disintegrated in a brilliant fireball. "Splash 1, Sarah announced with the professional calm that characterized pilots, who viewed air combat as a technical problem to be solved rather than a life and death struggle. The remaining aircraft are reorganizing, but they've lost their tactical coordination. Viper flight. Execute attack sequence Alpha on my mark. The destruction of their formation leader sent visible shock waves through the hostile aircraft, their previously coordinated attacks dissolving into individual defensive maneuvers as they struggled to adapt to the loss of their tactical commander. Sarah had anticipated this reaction and was already positioning herself to exploit the confusion that followed the disruption of their command structure. Jesus Christ, she just took out their leader like it was a training exercise, Thompson gasped, her damaged aircraft still struggling to maintain altitude while she watched Sarah's tactical display with growing amazement. Who flies like that? It's like she can predict what they're going to do before they do it. Sarah's second attack was even more devastating than the first. Her F-16 diving from altitude to engage two hostile aircraft that had attempted to coordinate a pincer movement against Rodriguez's position. The maneuver required split-second timing and three-dimensional thinking that went far beyond anything the young pilots had encountered in training. But Sarah executed it with the fluid grace of someone for whom such tactics were second nature. Viper 2, break left and climb. Sarah commanded while simultaneously engaging both hostile aircraft with cannon fire that demonstrated marksmanship skills that bordered on the supernatural. These guys are trying to use vertical separation to gain advantage, but they're telegraphing their intentions through their formation positioning. The twin streams of 20mm cannon fire found their targets with devastating accuracy, the hostile aircraft exploding in rapid succession as Sarah's experience allowed her to exploit targeting opportunities that would have been invisible to less skilled pilots. Her attacks were so precise that they seemed almost casual, but the young pilots watching recognized the kind of tactical brilliance that separated legends from ordinary aviators. Splash 2 and 3, Sarah announced while pulling her F-16 into a climbing turn that positioned her for engagement with the remaining hostile aircraft. The enemy formation is breaking up, but they're still dangerous. Maintain defensive posture and follow my tactical instructions exactly. The remaining 15 hostile aircraft were beginning to show signs of panic as they realized they were facing an opponent whose capabilities exceeded anything they had encountered in their previous combat experience. Their attempts to coordinate attacks were being systematically disrupted by Sarah's superior positioning and tactical awareness, forcing them into individual defensive maneuvers that negated their numerical advantage. Phantom, how did you know exactly where they were going? To be? Chen's voice carried the amazement of someone who was witnessing tactical perfection that seemed almost supernatural. It's like you can read their minds or something. Sarah's response was delivered while she executed a series of maneuvers that brought her into position to engage 3 more hostile aircraft with a single missile shot. Lieutenant, combat experience teaches you to recognize patterns in enemy behavior. These pilots are well trained, but they're operating according to doctrine that I've studied for years. Their strengths become predictable once you understand their tactical philosophy. Her next missile launch demonstrated the kind of tactical creativity that separated exceptional pilots from merely competent ones. The AIM-120 was fired at an angle that seemed to offer no chance of success, but Sarah had calculated the enemy aircraft's probable evasive maneuvers and positioned the missile to intercept them at the optimal point in their defensive sequence. Splash 4, Sarah announced as another enemy aircraft dissolved in a brilliant explosion. Viper flight, the remaining aircraft are going to attempt a coordinated withdrawal. Don't let them escape to regroup and attack again. The battle continued with Sarah systematically dismantling the hostile formation through superior tactics and experience that the young pilots were beginning to recognize as the mark of a true combat legend. Each engagement demonstrated skills that went far beyond anything they had encountered in training, revealing the gap between peacetime preparation and actual combat experience. My God, Harrison's voice crackled through the radio from the control tower. his tone carrying the awe of someone who was witnessing tactical perfection. She's not just fighting them, she's teaching them a lesson in air combat that they'll never forget. This is what real fighter pilot capability looks like. The remaining hostile aircraft were beginning to realize that they were facing an opponent whose skills exceeded their own by margins that made continued engagement suicidal. Their formation discipline was collapsing under the pressure of Sarah's relentless attacks, forcing them into increasingly desperate maneuvers that only made them more vulnerable to her superior tactical awareness. As the engagement reached its climax, Sarah's F-16 moved through the hostile formation with the grace of a dancer and the lethality of a predator. Each maneuver perfectly calculated to exploit weaknesses that only someone with extensive combat experience could recognize. The young pilots watching from below were witnessing the kind of aerial combat mastery that would be studied in military academies for generations to come. The final phase of the engagement unfolded with the inexorable precision of a master chess player executing a winning combination that had been planned dozens of moves in advance. Sarah's F-16 moved through the remaining hostile aircraft with surgical efficiency, each maneuver perfectly timed to exploit the tactical vulnerabilities that panic had created in their formation. The enemy pilot's discipline had completely collapsed under the pressure of facing an opponent whose skills exceeded their own by margins they had never imagined possible. "Viper flight, observe the enemy's withdrawal pattern," Sarah commanded, while simultaneously engaging two hostile aircraft that had attempted to coordinate a desperate attack on her position. "They're trying to use terrain masking to break contact, but their electronic emissions are giving away their exact positions." This is a perfect example of how over-reliance on technology can become a tactical liability. Her cannon fire found its targets with devastating accuracy, the 20mm rounds tearing through the hostile aircraft's defensive systems with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The twin explosions lit up the morning sky as the enemy pilots' attempts to coordinate their final attack were systematically destroyed by Sarah's superior marksmanship and tactical awareness. "Splash 12 and 13, Sarah announced with the professional calm that characterized pilots who viewed air combat as a technical problem to be solved through superior skill rather than emotional intensity. "The remaining aircraft are attempting to disengage, but they're using predictable escape routes that can be easily intercepted." The young pilots watching from below were witnessing a masterclass in air combat that would reshape their understanding of what was possible when experience met determination at 30,000 feet. Rodriguez's voice carried the awe of someone who was beginning to comprehend the true meaning of combat excellence. "Phantom, I've never seen anything like this," Rodriguez gasped, his earlier confidence replaced by the humility that came from witnessing true professional mastery. "You're not just defeating them, you're making it look effortless. How is this possible?" Sarah's response was delivered while she executed a climbing turn that brought her into perfect position to intercept the remaining hostile aircraft's escape route. "Lieutenant, what you're witnessing is the result of 30 years of continuous training and 10 years of hunting these particular opponents. Experience is the only teacher that matters in actual combat." Her final missile launch was timed with the precision of someone who had calculated every variable in the tactical equation, the AIM-120 streaking through the sky to intercept the fleeing hostile aircraft at the exact moment when their defensive maneuvers would prove inadequate. The explosion marked the end of organized resistance from the enemy formation. "Splash 14, Sarah announced while scanning the sky for the remaining hostile aircraft that were scattering in all directions like startled birds. "The enemy formation is completely broken. Individual aircraft are attempting to escape, but they're no longer capable of coordinated action." The transformation in the tactical situation was so complete that it seemed almost miraculous to the young pilots, who had been facing certain death just minutes earlier. Thompson's voice carried the disbelief of someone whose entire worldview had been fundamentally altered by witnessing combat excellence that seemed to transcend normal human capabilities. "I can't believe this is happening," Thompson whispered. Her damaged aircraft finally able to maintain stable flight, now that the coordinated attacks had ceased. 20 minutes ago we were about to be killed by overwhelming opposition, and now they're running away like frightened children. What kind of pilot can do this? Sarah's F-16 pursued the fleeing hostile aircraft with the relentless efficiency of someone who understood that allowing experienced enemy pilots to escape meant they would return with better tactics and more determination. Her pursuit was methodical and professional, each engagement designed to eliminate threats while conserving ammunition for potential follow-up encounters. The kind of pilot who has spent decades learning that combat is about more than technology or youth, Sarah replied while engaging the 15th hostile aircraft with cannon fire that demonstrated marksmanship skills that bordered on the supernatural. "It's about understanding your enemy, exploiting their weaknesses, and never underestimating the value of experience." The enemy pilot's aircraft disintegrated under the withering accuracy of Sarah's gun runs, his attempt to escape failing against someone who had anticipated his every maneuver. The destruction of the 15th hostile aircraft left only 3 survivors from the original 18 aircraft formation that had seemed so overwhelming just minutes earlier. "Splash 15, Sarah announced while turning her attention to the remaining hostile aircraft that were attempting to use electronic warfare systems to mask their escape. "The survivors are using advanced countermeasures, but they're broadcasting their positions through their emission patterns. Technology becomes a liability when you don't understand its limitations." The final 3 enemy aircraft were destroyed in rapid succession as Sarah's superior tactical awareness allowed her to predict their evasive maneuvers and position her attacks for maximum effectiveness. Each engagement demonstrated the kind of 3-dimensional thinking that separated exceptional pilots from merely competent ones. "Splash 16, 17, and 18, Sarah announced as the last hostile aircraft exploded in a brilliant fireball that marked the end of the most one-sided aerial engagement in modern military history. All hostile aircraft destroyed. Viper. Flight. Form up on me for return to base." The radio silence that followed Sarah's final kill report reflected the stunned disbelief of everyone who had witnessed an elderly civilian observer transform into a combat legend who had single-handedly destroyed 18 enemy aircraft while saving the lives of 4 young pilots. The tactical display showed clear skies where minutes earlier it had been filled with hostile contacts. "Jesus Christ, she killed all of them," Chun whispered, his voice carrying the awe of someone who had witnessed tactical perfection that seemed to transcend normal human capabilities. 18 experienced enemy pilots, and she made it look like a training exercise. Colonel Morrison's voice crackled through the radio from the control tower, his tone carrying the reverence that characterized military professionals who had witnessed true combat excellence. "Phantom, this is Overlord. Outstanding work. You've just demonstrated why certain legends never really die. Those young pilots owe you their lives." Sarah's response was delivered with the quiet professionalism that had characterized her entire career, her voice carrying no trace of the satisfaction that might have been expected from someone who had just achieved the impossible. "Colonel, this is what happens when you underestimate someone based on their age or appearance. Those enemy pilots made the same mistake your squadron has been making for months." The flight home was conducted in respectful silence as the young pilots processed the reality that they had been rescued by someone they had spent months dismissing as a harmless civilian observer. Their earlier confidence had been replaced by the humility that came from understanding how much they still had to learn about aerial combat. As the 5 F-16s approached Nellis Air Force Base, Sarah's final radio transmission carried the quiet authority of someone who had just reminded the world why certain call signs were spoken with reverence in military circles around the globe. "Tower, this is Phantom Flight returning to base. Mission accomplished. And gentlemen, remember that the most dangerous enemy is often the one you never see coming. The debriefing room fell silent as Sarah removed her helmet, her silver hair, catching the fluorescent lights that had once made her seem so ordinary. The young pilots who had mocked Grandma Mac now stood at attention, their faces showing the profound respect that only comes from witnessing true greatness under fire. "Ma'am," Rodriguez began, his voice barely above a whisper, "we owe you our lives, and we owe you an apology for everything we said, everything we assumed." Sarah's pale blue eyes softened with the wisdom that comes from decades of service. "Lieutenant, assumptions are the enemy of every pilot. You assumed age meant weakness. Those enemy pilots assumed experience didn't matter. Both assumptions proved fatal for them, not for you." Thompson stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "How do we even begin to thank you? You could have let us die up there after the way we treated you." "Because that's not who we are," Sarah replied simply. "We protect those who serve, regardless of how they've treated us. That's what makes us different from our enemies." Colonel Morrison entered with Sarah's official reinstatement papers. "Colonel McKenzie, the Pentagon wants to discuss your next assignment. It seems Phantom is needed elsewhere." Sarah smiled, the same quiet smile she'd worn while filing reports. "There's always another mission, another group of young pilots who need protection. Some of us never really retire, we just change call signs." As she walked toward the door, Sarah paused and looked back at the young aviators whose lives she'd saved. "Remember, the person sitting quietly in the corner might be the most dangerous warrior in the room. Never underestimate anyone based on what you see on the surface." The door closed behind her, leaving the pilots with a lesson they'd never forget. Heroes don't always announce themselves with fanfare. Sometimes they just show up when you need them most. What did you think of this incredible story? Have you ever underestimated someone based on their age or appearance? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing true stories that will change how you see the world around you.